Welcome back to 303 and to a lecture on the introduction to the book of Genesis from the Bible. I'm engaged in an overview lecture here that I just want to make sure that we're kind of covering some ground before we get into some specific lectures. We've got about 8 to 10 lectures that we'll give for you on the book of Genesis itself. We're going to try to outline this first book of what is often referred to as the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. Now, this is really important. If you have not yet watched my 2 introductory lectures, then I really do recommend that you go ahead and watch those 2 lectures before you pick up this conversation. That will be significant to just make sure that you understand what the focus, the point of our non-apologetic study of biblical text, as we outlined it in those other 2 lectures, is about. The information at the bottom of the site there for YouTube will show you, direct you where to go find those other 2 lectures. Let's talk for a few moments now about Torah. This is a word often translated as law, but probably a really bad translation in the end. There's a number of reasons usually ascribed to why law was going to be the primary definition of Torah. But really, teaching is the better translation, and I like to use this kind of a translation because I think it focuses a little bit better on the point that we want to make about our study of not only the book of Genesis, but the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Proverbs 1:8 is a classic example referencing this notion of Torah as actually instruction or teaching. Hear, my child, your father's instruction, and do not reject your mother's teaching, is this word. Again, I want to go back to this word picture of the drama between a God and a God's people, and so much of that drama is about instruction. It's about teaching, and so we'll ask again about that relationship between a God and a God's people. It is the development in many ways. This is what we'll really focus on, the development of this relationship. Sometimes, as in all relationships, it's messy, sometimes it's good. One of the first questions that has to be asked is the authorship question. So let's go ahead and engage in that. I'm assuming that you're taking a few notes, so this will be the moment where maybe we ask this question. Traditionally, the author of this book, along with the other 4 to follow, the Pentateuch, has been ascribed to Moses. But we're probably pretty sure that it wasn't just Moses, at least not fully. For example, there's any number of ways that we could talk about this. Genesis 12:6 tells us that Abram passed through the land of the place of Shechem to the oak of Moreh, and at that time, we're told, the Canaanites were in the land. At that time seems to suggest that there's a looking backwards to the writing of this material. The question of authorship by scholars has often led to a discussion about if there isn't a single author, namely Moses, then where does all of this material come from? I'll mention, just so that you have this information in your notes, I won't talk a lot about it, but I'll mention what we call the documentary hypotheses. Now, what is this? Well, it tries to look at the material of the text, especially in the original language, and ask the question, can we derive any information about authorship from the language that is used? And typically, scholars have argued that there's kind of 4 sources that might have helped to create some of these texts that we will be studying. They're listed often by letters. Some of this has to do with German scholarship when it first happened. We'll refer to them as the sources and the 4 sources. I'll go through them quickly. If you're interested in this kind of thing, because I'm not going to spend a lot of time with it, but if you're interested in this kind of thing, there's all kinds of information online and in books, lots of scholars providing information about this. The J source, as it's often referred to, will reference the name of deity as Yahweh, and here often translated as Lord. The E source will use a different, usually, name for God, Elohim. This is usually translated as God. We know that there's some priestly overlays, which usually uses Elohim as its reference to God. One of the reasons why we're pretty convinced that somebody else had a hand in the writing of this of these first 5 books of the Bible. I mentioned already Numbers 12:3 is a problematic passage if you believe Moses is the sole author of this text. We're told that Moses was the most humble man. We normally wouldn't assume Moses would write that about himself, and of course the argument has always been, if Moses is the one writing much of this material, why is the first person pronoun I never used? The last of the 4 sources is the D source. This is the source of Deuteronomy itself. We know there were probably other sources in terms of other texts. For example, a problematic passage in Numbers 21:14 references the, quote, Book of Wars. You can go ahead and spend some time looking at that later in our lecture on Numbers. We'll come to this. But obviously the question is, what is this book? Where is this book? We know then that there were probably other kinds of sources that could have been, redacted, a part of this process of where these texts come from. One of the ways we can do this is just to look closely, for example, at the information that we'll be looking at in our next lecture, actually, the creation stories as they're provided for us in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. When you study closely those creation stories, especially in the original language, we find that there's 2 different names used for deity. Again, we find ourselves discussing the J source, the E source here. This at least leads to the authorship quandary. I like to call it the quandary. But the reality, of course, is that it really doesn't matter who Homer was in the writing of the Iliad, the Odyssey. We will simply say that we pick up the text and we're going to study it. Again, our non-apologetic approach is not really to get lost in the weeds of these kinds of discussions, but rather to just look at the text itself. And from here on out, that's exactly what I'm going to do. So let's turn now in your notes, and let's just simply give an overview from a couple of different perspectives on this amazing book. Now, I'm going to struggle with this. Every time I talk with you about a book from the Bible, it seems as if I'm going to argue that it might be the most compelling book of the entire canon. Please forgive me for this, because it's an amazing text overall, and each of these individual texts are quite compelling. However, when you look at the history of Western thought and Western literature, it's pretty easy to kind of go down the road of arguing that the book of Genesis is the most important. The stories, the characters, they are truly compelling. I lament that so many of my students don't know these stories. Hopefully at the end of our lectures on Genesis, you'll at least know a little bit more. And again, to go back to what I said in my first 2 lectures, my goal is to help you to become a reader of this text yourself, to actually pick it up and to enjoy reading it. Genesis divides up rather nicely, actually, into 2 parts, so let's talk about it. Often, scholars have referred to these 2 parts as the primeval history, which focuses on basically all of humanity, chapters 1, verses 1 through chapters 11, verse 26, if you're taking notes. And the second is what we'll often refer to as the ancestral history, which focuses on Abraham, who is going to be a pivotal character in this text, the book of Genesis, and of course his descendants, right? Beginning with chapters 11, verse 27, and going to the end of the book, chapter 50, verse 26. Let's talk about the primeval history for just a moment. It actually divides into 2 parts rather nicely. Chapters 1, again, verses 1 through chapters 11, verse 26. First, we are going to have the creation story and or stories. We'll talk about that one. The first humans, we'll talk about Adam and Eve and, of course, their progeny. And, of course, the violence that will then follow that, as well as the catastrophic flood. And we'll talk a lot about that as well. That will take us from Genesis 1, verse 1 through Genesis 6, verse 4. The second part of this primeval history, then, is what we'll call recreation, the redistributing of humans after the flood, the multiplication of humans, and the challenges that will attend that. Roughly Genesis 6, verse 5 through Genesis 11, verse 26. And roughly around chapter 11, verse 27, we will then move into the ancestral history, which is going to then begin to focus the prism more closely, specifically on, beginning with this classic character, Abraham. First named Abram. His name will be changed later for reasons that we'll talk about, as is his wife, Sarai, who later will be named Sarah. We'll talk about why. The ancestral history actually divides into three parts as well, so let's kind of work through those really quickly. First, you have what is often referred to as the gift of the divine promise. Abraham is going to be told something remarkable is going to happen because of you and because of your life, and that will then lead, obviously, to all of the events to follow. This whole saga unfolds starting in Genesis 11:27. And this part, at least part one of the ancestral history, will go through 25:11, Genesis 25, verse 11. Second, you have the divergent destinies of the descendants of the two sons of Abraham, first Ishmael and then Isaac. Isaac's, of course, two sons, Jacob and Esau. And here we're talking now Genesis 25:12 through 35:29. And then finally, the third and final part of this ancestral history is the different divergent destinies of the descendants of Esau, and then finally Jacob. And of course, Jacob's name will later be changed to Israel, and this will be a significant moment that we'll talk about. Genesis 36:1 through 50:26. And so that kind of gives you a general outline of the text. The actual outline of Genesis is actually united, many scholars have argued, by this Toledot, this descendants genealogies lists. It's interesting the number of students who I've spoken to who will say, you know, these lists of these names, they get kind of boring and I like to skip over them. I'm going to make the argument in ensuing lectures, we don't want to do this. We really want to pay attention to these lists. They are significant for us in our study. And of course, they're going to resurrect one of the major themes of the book of Genesis, namely, where did you come from and where are you going? The idea of roots, the idea of lineage is going to be central to the reading of this text. We'll see the first of these, by the way, in Genesis 2, verse 4, and then the last of them in Genesis 37:2. The focus is really from the world, the large focus, finally to the 12 sons of Jacob. Now, let's provide another kind of outline. That's one way to look at this text. Let's go ahead and now provide maybe a little different kind of an outline here. How would we divide, if you will, the book of Genesis up another way or a different way, maybe a little bit more detailed way? First, and we'll be giving lectures over each of these, obviously. You have the creation and the first peoples, chapters 1 through 6, verse 8. Second, we'll have the flood, the recreation, the Tower of Babel, which for us will be a very influential story, chapter 6, verse 9 through 11:9. Third, we're going to have a genealogy bridge of sorts to ancestral history, chapters 11, verse 10 through chapter 26. And then finally, we're going to have this ancestral history that I just talked about, again, divided up into the three sections, chapter 11, 28 through 50, 26. Again, the first division will be this promise and then the story of Isaac, very significant, chapters 11, verse 28 through 25:11. Second, we're going to have this division, again, divided up into the two parts of Ishmael's descendants, chapters 25, verse 12 through 18, and then Isaac's descendants, Esau and Jacob, chapters 25, 19 through 35, 29. The third division, again, divided up into the two main parts of Esau's descendants, chapters 36, 1 through 43. And then, obviously, the greater focus for the remainder of the book, Jacob or Israel's descendants, especially the story of Joseph, is going to be a compelling story for us, chapters 37, verses 1 through chapter 50, 26. So that's kind of a general overview. And that's, again, just another way to look at this book. But we now want to turn for the remainder of this brief talk and look at the book of Genesis and our focus from a different perspective, from even a third perspective, and that is to say, topic-driven perspective. When we pick up the Iliad, for example, and we want to know, what is this text about? We often will mention in 303, we want to be looking at these ideas or these focus. And so let's go through it. What is the book of Genesis about? Well, any number of things, and I'll be mentioning all of these in ensuing lectures, but let's go ahead and put them in your notes now. First of all, we're going to look at this as being a story of family. Hugely important. Think about really quickly just the number of novels and books that you have read, movies that you have seen in the literary tradition of the West, that at the root really are just a treatment of family. I mean, think about how compelling an idea that is. Fathers and sons, of course, fathers and daughters. And I want to point out as well, this is not just a story of men, fathers and sons. It really is going to be for us right away a compelling question about the role of women. Some have argued that even you can find at times almost like a matriarchy in play. Women have tremendous power in the book of Genesis, as we will see. And in what ways do they have power? How do they wield power? We'll obviously debate this topic as we get into it. We'll, of course, raise this question about what does the model family look like as we think about it. So, for example, when we pick up Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman and we look at that family, or we look, for example, at the family of Eugene O'Neill's Long Day's Journey into Night, there's this notion of what is the family and what it's supposed to look like and how is it supposed to act and perform. And we'll obviously ask, is there a model family in the book of Genesis? And if so, what does it look like? What determines a successful family, for example? We'll define the family as well as not just an individual unit, but even the human race, and then smaller, the Jewish nation, and of course individual families and extended families as well. Huge, huge, important topic for us to look at. Another is, this is a story of male-female relationships. For example, we begin with Adam and Eve, and of course Abraham and Sarah, and then all of the others, right? We'll note how, of course, men treat women. We'll have to talk at some point, obviously, about historically the patriarchy and what goes on there. But we're also going to ask about how women treat men. This is, of course, also a story about place. This is huge, and I would make sure that you have it in your notes because we definitely want to be paying attention to this one as well. And let's just say it this way. Geography matters in this text. We begin, for example, think of this. We begin in Eden, which is often thought of as kind of Babylon or that area way out there to the east of the Promised Land. At the end of the book of Genesis, we end up in Egypt. But we always have in the back of our mind this notion of the land promised to Abraham, the promised land, which ultimately becomes for us in the book of Genesis and beyond, and the book of Exodus and beyond, really a significant mantra. Let's point out that this is a story about rewards and punishments, no question, gains and losses. We start, for example, think of this with the loss of Eden. You cannot really read maybe the most important single poem in the English language, Paradise Lost by Milton, without understanding this notion of the loss of Eden, right? We end the book of Genesis with the growth of what we're told is a whole lot of people. Some have argued over 1 million people in a new Eden, that is to say, in Egypt, until a new Pharaoh, we're told at the beginning of the book of Exodus, comes along who did not know Joseph. Right? And that, of course, leads to the need for an exodus, a few hundred years later. Again, we're back to this notion of journey. So let's go ahead and put that one in our notes because obviously this was a hypercritical one for us, right? Genesis is a story of journeys, of travels, of trips. Now, these trips can be of multiple kinds. They can obviously be physical. They can also be mental, emotional, spiritual, we might say. We're going to ask about all of the different journeys, all of the different struggles in this book. Of course, we're going to tie this constantly back, aren't we, to the works of Western thought and Western literature that are constantly emphasizing this. We'll recognize you cannot read, for example, a classic text like Pilgrim's Progress without understanding the book of Genesis and all the different kinds of journeys and struggles that are there. I'd like to point out that this is a linguistic book as well. It's a book of talking. It's a book of words. Of course, we think of Hamlet's words, 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 don't we? The conversations, we've already raised this question of if God talked, what language did God use? Language is going to be significant. By the time we get to the Tower of Babel, we'll see this. But the conversations between God and God's people are going to serve really our whole reading of the entire Bible. When we get to the prophets, those amazing prophets, we'll talk about the ways in which conversation and communication are so critical. We'll note the way God talks to humans. We'll note the way humans try to talk to God. We'll look, for example, at the questions of God. I would write this one down right now. This is a compelling way to study the book of Genesis. Every time God speaks, if God speaks with a question, jot down that question and notice the kind of questions. For example, in Genesis 3, we'll get there in a couple of lectures. The question is, where are you? This is a very interesting question. I mean, especially in the language of the Hebrew. It's not just questioning where physically, geographically one is, but rather where one is, how would one say it, morally, spiritually, emotionally? You could argue that this is the question of the book of Genesis. Some have argued it's the question of the entire Bible. Where are you from and where are you going seems to be one of the mantras as well. Constantly we're thinking about this notion of travel. Of course, you couldn't expect an English teacher to talk without talking about this being a story of symbols as well. There are so many symbols that we're going to recognize, right? All of these symbols are in the end going to end up in all kinds of Western texts. I mean, we can think about the very idea of a new or a promised land, and then think about, for example, Shakespeare's Tempest and that line, Brave New World, which will, of course, become Huxley's title as well. So we'll be looking at this idea of the symbolism. What does Eden represent? What does the flood represent? What does the ark that is a part of that flood narrative represent? And on and on and on it goes. Obviously, the characters of this text, each in their own way, become archetypal types of characters, and we'll obviously ask about that. This is a story of repeats. Think about that as you pick up this book and read it with me. Note how many times, for example, you have repetitions that are quite fascinating. For example, the man at the well